Hey Team Bio, welcome to our screencast on symbiotic relationships. So we have been discussing bouncing back and forth between a couple different big ideas in biology. We've been talking about how to conduct a good experiment. We have been learning how to use the microscopes. We've been talking about genetics and evolution, and we've also been talking about big ideas in ecology, nutrient cycling and energy flow, the 10% trophic rule, and all that jazz. Here is another big concept in ecology, and it's called symbiotic relationships. So the definition of a symbiotic relationship, it's a close ecological relationship or I guess I should say relationships between two or more organisms. Okay, so this is our definition of symbiotic relationships, and we're going to have three different examples, all of which are symbiotic relationship: mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism, and we'll talk about them in that order. Okay, so a mutualistic symbiotic relationship is a relationship that's beneficial to both of the individuals that take part in that relationship. So a great example of that is pollinators and their plants. What does the pollinator get out of this interaction? Well, it gets out a meal of either simple sugar or sometimes protein. So it's getting a meal. And the plant, what is it getting out of this relationship? Well, it's actually getting sex. When a bee pollinates a flower, pollen from the stamens of the flower rub off on the bee, which then flies to another flower and delivers the pollen, which is basically the plant sperm, to the female part of another flower. So the bees are little carrying messengers of the plant sperm from plant to plant. So it's a pollen delivery system from one flower to the next. This benefits both parties. The pollinators get a free meal, or not free. They're doing a job. They're moving gametes around, and the plants get fertilized. Okay, another example of mutualism is the thing that we've been looking at in class, or some of you have been looking at in class. Not everyone's gotten there yet. Well, hopefully most of you have by the end of this period. Okay, here we have a termite, and inside of its gut is a tiny protist called a trichonympha. Trichonympa. Trichonympha. So this mutualistic relationship is kind of a feeding relationship for both. So the termite eats wood, but it can't digest the wood itself. Inside of its hindgut lives this little protist, this trichonympha, that digests the wood down into pieces that the termite can eat. So the termite is providing food, but also getting food out of this relationship. And the trichonympha is also getting food, as well as a home, a safe home from this relationship. So it's good for both of them. Without the trichonympha, the termite would not be able to eat, and without the termite, the trichonympha wouldn't have this safe, cozy, warm, lovely place to live and get fed on a routine basis. So it's very good for both of them. Okay, the next example that we have of a symbiotic relationship is parasitism. This relationship is good for one, it's good for somebody, but it's bad for somebody else involved in the relationship. Okay, so here is an example of parasitism. Here we have a human, and here we have an engorged tick. Oops, not titch, tick. So, what is the tick getting out of this relationship? Well, it's getting a meal, blood. What is the human losing from this relationship? Well, the human is losing a little blood. Tiny loss of blood. But the more nefarious part of this relationship is that the tick is carrying a disease, potentially. And so the humans are going to get a disease, maybe Lyme disease. So this is good for the tick. It's getting a meal. It's bad for the human because it's potentially getting Lyme disease. Another example of parasitism is what's called an oak tree gall. So here we have an oak leaf. And this structure right here, this round structure, is called a gall. Inside of this round gall, if we were to break it open, we would see a little worm. This worm is actually going to metamorphose inside of this gall into what's called a non-stinging wasp. The little worm is a wasp larva. What happens here? The non-stinging wasps lay their eggs on these oak trees, and when the larvae emerge, they secrete a hormone that causes the oak tree itself to grow this gall structure around the baby wasp larva. So if you break open the structure, you'll see this whole network of filaments, and this is where the non-stinging wasp is going to turn from a larva into a flying insect inside this gall. So it's good for the wasp because it gets a home and food. It's bad for the oak tree because it just gets tricked. This is actually oak tissue. These are made up of oak cells here. So it's spending energy building a home for the wasp. So the hormone that the wasp secretes causes the oak to build this structure, and it loses energy and cells, encapsulating a wasp in a way that it's not necessarily wanting to, but it's hormonally tricked into doing so. So this is good for the wasp, bad for the oak. If you walk around the woods right now, you might be seeing some of these on the ground. They're all over the place. Okay. And our last example of symbiotic relationships is called commensalism. This is a relationship which is good for one organism, and then the other is like totally unaffected. Okay, some people argue that commensalism is not actually a real category. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so an example of commensalism would be the zebra and this bird called the cattle egret. So the idea in this relationship is the zebra is just walking around, grazing, eating the grassland, eating grass off the savanna, and in doing so, in walking around, it is kicking up dust and dirt and also scaring up little insects. And in its process of living its life and scaring up these little insects unintentionally, the cattle egret is following it around and eating the insects that are roused from the grasses. So the cattle egret is getting food out of this relationship, and the zebra is like unaffected by the presence of the cattle egret. Okay, another example of commensalism is between whales and barnacles. So, a barnacle is a tiny little sea creature that forms a calcium shell and then filter feeds in the water, and they can be stuck to fixed structures, but they can also reside on living things. So in this example, the whale is just living its life, swimming around the ocean, eating its krill and doing its thing, and the barnacles are just along for the ride, and they're filter feeding wherever the whale goes. So it's good for the barnacles because they have a home, a moving home that is swimming them around the ocean, and the whale is pretty unaffected by the presence of the barnacles. Okay, the reason why people argue that commensalism is a false category is that they say that either commensalism is just like really low-key mutualism or it's low-key parasitism. So to give you what I mean by that, like potentially the cattle egret is eating some of the bugs that would have otherwise bitten the zebra. So the zebra is actually slightly positively impacted by this relationship. And in terms of the whale and the barnacle, these barnacles can weigh up to like thousands of pounds. In the total mass of the whale, it's like not very much at all, but it is still extra weight that the whale has to carry around. So potentially, rather than being totally unaffecting the whale, it's a slight negative for the whale to carry all these barnacles around the ocean. Okay, so there you have it. These are our 3 different types of symbiotic relationships: mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. Other interspecific interactions. Interspecific means between different species. We have predation, which is a positive for one, a negative for the other that's being preyed on. Herbivory, this is like when an animal eats a plant. It's good for the animal, it's bad for the plant. And then competition is between when 2 different species are competing for the same resources. So imagine 2 different species of birds competing for the same type of berry. The presence of one is bad for the other and vice versa. So competition is negative for both. We don't consider these interspecific interactions to be symbioses because they're not proximately or physically as close enough to count within those categories. But these are other types of interactions that we see between living things. Okay, that's all.